Imagine being the most decorated war hero in galactic history, having saved entire star systems from annihilation, commanding fleets that span light years, and being feared by the most dangerous alien civilizations in the cosmos. Now imagine walking into a high school cafeteria where nobody knows your name, nobody cares about your achievements, and the biggest concern is whether you'll sit alone at lunch. This is the story of Commander Sarah Chan, the woman who ended the Zephyrian War, who negotiated peace with the Void Syndicate, and who single-handedly prevented the collapse of 3 different galactic governments. But none of that matters when you're 17 again, stuck in a temporal loop that's reset your body while keeping your mind intact, attending Jefferson High School where your biggest challenge isn't alien invasions, it's fitting in with teenagers who think you're just another weird new kid. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in the depths of space. Sometimes they're fought in the halls of high school, where your greatest enemy isn't a cosmic horror, it's social anxiety, and your most powerful weapon isn't a plasma cannon, it's trying to remember how to be a normal teenager when you've spent decades being anything but normal. What happens when humanity's greatest protector has to learn how to protect herself from the most dangerous predators in the universe, high school students? The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through Sarah Chan's consciousness like a plasma blade through hull plating. For a split second, her hand moved toward where her sidearm would have been, muscle memory from decades of combat scenarios. Instead, her fingers found only empty air and the soft fabric of civilian pajamas. She opened her eyes to stare at a ceiling covered in glow-in-the-dark stars, a teenager's attempt at bringing the cosmos indoors. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd commanded actual starships, watched real suns be born and die, negotiated with beings that existed in 11 dimensions, and now she was looking at plastic decorations that would have made her laugh if the situation weren't so desperately surreal. Sarah sat up slowly, examining her hands in the morning light streaming through curtains decorated with cartoon planets. 17-year-old hands, smooth and unmarked by the scars that had once told the story of her battles across the galaxy. The temporal displacement had been thorough, reverting her body to its teenage state while leaving her mind intact with 43 years of memories, experiences, and the weight of decisions that had shaped the fate of civilizations. The bedroom door burst open without warning, and Sarah's enhanced reflexes kicked in. She spun toward the threat, calculating angles and potential weapons before recognizing the face of the woman who had raised this version of herself. "Sarah, honey, you're going to be late for your first day." The woman she was supposed to call Mom stood in the doorway, holding a piece of toast and looking harried in the way that parents do when managing morning routines. This woman had died when Sarah was 19, killed in the first Zephyrian attack on Earth. Seeing her alive, vibrant, and concerned about something as mundane as school attendance created a knot in Sarah's chest that felt heavier than any burden she'd carried as a commander. "I'm up," Sarah managed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. Higher pitched, younger, lacking the authority that had once commanded respect across 3 galaxies. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm getting ready." Her mother smiled and retreated, closing the door behind her. Sarah remained sitting on the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror across the room. The face looking back at her was achingly familiar yet completely foreign. This was her face before the augmentations, before the genetic modifications that had been necessary to survive in hostile environments, before the subtle changes that came with decades of exposure to various alien atmospheres and technologies. She was purely human again, in a way she hadn't been for longer than most people on this planet had been alive. Standing up, Sarah moved to the window and looked out at the suburban neighborhood that had been her childhood home. Everything was exactly as she remembered it, down to the crack in the sidewalk where she'd fallen off her bike at age 8. The temporal displacement hadn't just reset her body, it had somehow pulled her back to this specific point in time, to the beginning of her senior year of high school. The year that would change everything. In her original timeline, this had been when she'd met Dr. Marcus Webb, the quantum physics teacher whose theories about interdimensional travel had seemed like science fiction until the Zephyrian invasion proved them terrifyingly real. It had been Webb who'd recognized her natural aptitude for 3-dimensional tactical thinking, who'd recommended her for the accelerated military program when the war began. But that was then, in a timeline that no longer existed. This time, she had knowledge that shouldn't exist yet, memories of technologies that wouldn't be invented for years, and the tactical experience that had made her humanity's greatest weapon against forces that threatened to annihilate everything she'd ever loved. The question was, what was she supposed to do with it? Sarah moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision, muscle memory guiding her through a shower and the complex process of selecting clothes from a teenage wardrobe that felt like a costume from another life. Every item seemed designed to broadcast youth and inexperience, concepts that felt alien to someone who'd once stood before the Galactic Council and demanded they reconsider their position on human rights. Downstairs, her father was reading a newspaper, actually printed on paper, something she hadn't seen outside of museums in decades. He looked up as she entered the kitchen, and she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. Like her mother, he'd been gone for so long in her memories that seeing him alive and whole created an emotional vertigo she wasn't prepared for. Nervous about the new school, he asked, his voice carrying the gentle concern she'd forgotten he was capable of. In her memories, he'd become a hero, a martyr who'd died defending evacuation ships from Zephyrian fighters. Here, he was just a man worried about his daughter's first day at a new high school. Something like that, Sarah replied, accepting a plate of eggs and toast that seemed impossibly normal given the circumstances. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. The temporal displacement had occurred during her final battle with the nihility, the cosmic horror that existed beyond normal spacetime. Her ship had been caught in the creature's reality-warping field as it died, and she remembered thinking that she'd die with it, that her sacrifice would at least ensure humanity's survival. Instead, she'd awakened here, in this impossible present that was somehow also her past. But why? Was this some final gift from a universe that had demanded so much from her? A chance to live the normal life she'd never had? Or was it something else entirely? Her mother drove her to Jefferson High School, keeping up a stream of cheerful chatter about new beginnings and making friends, advice that would have been touching if Sarah hadn't already lived through the experiences her mother was trying to prepare her for. As they pulled into the school parking lot, Sarah studied the building with tactical eyes, automatically noting sightlines, potential choke points, and escape routes before catching herself. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a high school. The greatest threats she was likely to face were pop quizzes and social embarrassment, not alien death squads and reality-bending cosmic horrors. The mental adjustment was more difficult than any physical training she'd ever endured. "Have a great day, sweetheart," her mother said, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "Remember, everyone's new at something. Just be yourself. Be herself." If only it were that simple. Which version of herself was she supposed to be? The awkward teenager she'd once been, or the seasoned commander she'd become? How do you be yourself when you're not entirely sure which self you're supposed to be? Sarah shouldered her backpack and walked toward the main entrance, joining a stream of students who moved with the casual confidence of people who'd never had to worry about anything more dangerous than a difficult test. Their conversations washed over her like white noise, complaints about homework, discussions of weekend plans, gossip about relationships and social hierarchies that seemed both familiar and utterly alien. The hallways were exactly as she remembered them, lined with lockers and filled with the particular acoustic chaos that only came from hundreds of teenagers trying to navigate their social environment. Sarah found herself automatically scanning for threats, identifying potential weapons, noting the positions of authority figures before forcing herself to relax. She stopped at the main office to collect her schedule, smiling politely at the secretary who welcomed her to Jefferson High with the kind of practiced enthusiasm that came from processing dozens of new students. The schedule in her hands was surreal: advanced physics, calculus, literature, history, chemistry. Subjects she'd mastered decades ago, taught by teachers who were decades behind the actual state of human knowledge. Her first class was advanced physics with Dr. Marcus Webb. The irony was almost overwhelming. In her original timeline, this man would become her mentor, the person who'd recognize her potential and set her on the path that would eventually lead to her commanding the defense of Earth. Here, she was just another student walking into his classroom, and he had no idea who she was or who she would become. Dr. Webb was younger than she remembered, his hair still darkened, his face unlined by the stress of war. He stood at the front of the classroom, writing equations on an actual blackboard with actual chalk, technology so primitive it might as well have been cave paintings compared to the holographic displays she was used to. Sarah took a seat in the middle of the classroom, not too close to appear eager, not too far back to seem disinterested. Around her, other students were settling in with the casual indifference of people who'd been in school together for years. She was the outsider, the unknown variable, and she could feel their curious glances like physical weight. "Welcome back, everyone," Dr. Webb said, turning to face the class. His eyes swept across the room and paused briefly on Sarah, the only unfamiliar face. "I see we have a new student. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?" The moment hung suspended in time as every eye in the room focused on her. In her previous life, she'd addressed the Combined Fleet Command, delivered ultimatums to alien warlords, and negotiated peace treaties that would be studied for generations. But, sitting in that classroom, facing the expectant stares of 17-year-old strangers, she felt more nervous than she had facing down a Zephyrian dreadnought. "I'm Sarah Chen," she said, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. "My family just moved here from Colorado." It was a simple lie, the cover story that had been established for this timeline. Simple and completely inadequate to explain the reality of her situation. She wasn't just new to Jefferson High, she was new to being human again, new to existing in a timeline where everything she'd fought for hadn't happened yet. "Welcome to Jefferson High, Sarah," Dr. Webb said with a smile that was genuinely warm. "I hope you'll find our physics program challenging." If only he knew. The equations he was writing on the board were child's play compared to the multi-dimensional mathematics she'd had to master to understand nihility physics. The concepts he was explaining were centuries behind the theoretical framework she'd used to navigate reality-warping battlefields. But she nodded politely and took notes, playing the role of an interested student while her mind raced through implications and possibilities. The rest of the class passed in a blur of fundamental physics that felt like reviewing ancient history. Sarah found herself automatically correcting the teacher's equations in her head, thinking of exceptions and applications that wouldn't be discovered for decades. When Dr. Webb asked if anyone had questions, she had to bite her tongue to keep from asking about quantum entanglement applications in faster-than-light communication, a technology that was still theoretical in this timeline. As the class ended and students began filing out, Dr. Webb approached her desk. "How did you find the material, Sarah? Too basic, I hope?" The question caught her off guard. Had she been that obvious? "It was interesting," she said carefully. "I've always enjoyed physics." "Good to hear. If you ever want to discuss more advanced concepts, I hold office hours after school on Wednesdays. I always enjoy talking with students who show real aptitude for the subject." There it was, the invitation that had started everything in her original timeline. The moment when her path toward becoming humanity's defender had truly begun. But this time was different. This time, she already knew where that path led, what it would cost, and what it would require her to become. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, gathering her books. The rest of the morning continued in the same surreal fashion. Each class was a journey through knowledge she'd already mastered, taught by teachers who had no idea they were instructing someone who'd once held the fate of the galaxy in her hands. In calculus, she solved differential equations that she'd once used to calculate hyperspace jump trajectories. In literature, they discuss themes of heroism and sacrifice in classical texts, concepts she'd lived through in ways the authors could never have imagined. But it was during lunch that the real challenge began. The cafeteria was a social minefield that made alien diplomacy seem straightforward by comparison. Sarah stood in the doorway with her tray, scanning the room not for tactical advantages but for somewhere to sit. Groups of students clustered around tables like separate nations, each with their own culture, allegiances, and unspoken rules. She recognized the social structures from her own teenage years, but experiencing them again from this perspective was like studying an alien civilization. The popular kids held court at the center tables, their conversations loud enough to broadcast their social dominance. The athletes occupied another section, their Letterman jackets serving as uniforms that identified their tribal affiliation. Artists, musicians, theater kids, and various other subgroups each maintained their own territories, boundaries as clearly defined as any star chart. And then, there were the tables occupied by individuals who didn't quite fit into any category, the social refugees who'd found safety in small groups or solitary isolation. Sarah had once been one of those refugees, awkward and uncertain, never quite finding her place in the complex ecosystem of adolescent society. But now she was something else entirely, a woman who'd commanded the respect of alien dignitaries and human admirals, reduced to standing in a high school cafeteria trying to figure out where she was allowed to sit. She chose an empty table near the windows, far enough from the main social clusters to avoid unwanted attention but positioned so she could observe the various groups. It was a tactical decision disguised as social awkwardness, and she settled into her seat to begin the complex process of eating cafeteria food while maintaining situational awareness. The food was exactly as she remembered, nutritionally adequate but lacking the complex flavors she'd grown accustomed to during her years traveling between worlds. She ate mechanically while watching the social dynamics play out around her, noting the subtle power structures and alliance networks that govern teenage society. "Is this seat taken?" Sarah looked up to find a girl standing beside her table, holding a lunch tray and looking uncertain. She was tall and gangly, with curly red hair and the kind of intelligence that showed in her eyes but hadn't yet learned to hide itself to fit in with social expectations. "No, please," Sarah said, gesturing to the chair. "I'm Sarah." "Amanda," the girl replied, sitting down with visible relief. "I hate the whole lunch thing. It's like social warfare, but with more rules and worse consequences." The observation was more accurate than Amanda probably realized. "You're not wrong," Sarah said. "Sometimes I think actual warfare would be simpler." Amanda laughed, assuming it was a joke. "Right? At least in war, you know who your enemies are supposed to be. Here, your best friend from yesterday might decide you're persona non grata because you wore the wrong shoes or something." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, both grateful to have found someone who understood the peculiar challenges of navigating teenage social dynamics. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly, remembering what it was like to have normal conversations about normal problems. "So what's your story?" Amanda asked. "New student, mysterious past, running from something dark and dramatic?" "Something like that," Sarah replied, which was probably the most honest thing she'd said all day. "What about you?" "Born here, never left, probably never will," Amanda said with the melodramatic despair that only teenagers could truly perfect. "My parents are convinced I'm going to be the first person in my family to go to college, so I'm taking every advanced class they'll let me into. It's like academic boot camp." Boot camp. Sarah almost smiled at the comparison. She'd been through actual boot camp multiple times and on multiple worlds. She'd endured training that would have broken most humans and education that had required her to think in ways that challenged the fundamental assumptions of human consciousness. Amanda's academic challenges were real to her, but, from Sarah's perspective, they were almost quaint. "What's your favorite subject?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "Physics, actually. Dr. Webb is amazing. He makes everything seem possible, like we're on the verge of discovering things that could change the world." Amanda's enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Sarah of her own teenage fascination with the possibilities of science. "What about you?" "Physics is interesting," Sarah said carefully. "I like the way it explains how things work, how everything connects." It was a vast understatement. Physics had become her native language, the framework through which she understood reality itself. She'd used quantum mechanics to navigate impossible geometries, employed relativistic calculations to survive temporal paradoxes, and mastered mathematical concepts that existed at the intersection of science and philosophy. But, sitting across from Amanda, she remembered what it had been like to encounter these ideas for the first time, to feel that sense of wonder at discovering how the universe actually worked. "Maybe we'll be in the same classes," Amanda said hopefully. "It would be nice to have someone to study with who doesn't think physics is just memorizing formulas." "I'd like that," Sarah replied, and meant it. Amanda reminded her of who she'd been before the war, before the responsibilities and the sacrifices and the weight of carrying humanity's survival on her shoulders. Having that reminder might be exactly what she needed to figure out how to navigate this impossible situation. The lunch period ended with the harsh sound of the bell, and students began the complex process of clearing tables and transitioning to their next classes. Sarah found herself walking alongside Amanda toward their afternoon classes, engaging in the kind of casual conversation that had once been as natural as breathing but now felt like a skill she'd forgotten how to use. "See you tomorrow?" Amanda asked as they reached the point where their paths diverged. "Absolutely," Sarah replied, watching as Amanda hurried off toward what she assumed was an advanced mathematics class. Sarah's next class was history, and, as she walked toward the classroom, she reflected on the profound irony of learning about events that, from her perspective, had happened in another timeline entirely. The history she'd lived through was dramatically different from what these textbooks would teach. Wars had been fought with different outcomes, discoveries had been made in different orders, and entire civilizations had risen and fallen in ways that this timeline would never experience. Unless, of course, the same forces that had shaped her original timeline were still at work. The thought stopped her cold in the middle of the hallway, causing other students to flow around her like water around a stone. What if her displacement wasn't just a random accident? What if the same cosmic forces that had led to humanity's near extinction were already in motion? She had knowledge of what was coming, understanding of the threats that would eventually emerge, but she also knew that her presence here might have already changed things in unpredictable ways. The temporal displacement had given her a second chance, but it might also have given her a responsibility she wasn't sure she wanted. Did she have an obligation to prevent the wars she'd fought, to stop the suffering she'd witnessed, to use her knowledge to change the course of history? Or would her interference only make things worse? These questions followed her into history class, where she sat through a lesson about World War II that felt like ancient history compared to the conflicts she'd lived through. The teacher, Mr. Patterson, was enthusiastic but limited by the perspective of his time. He spoke of strategy and tactics that would seem primitive to any civilization capable of interstellar warfare, discussed weapons that would be rendered obsolete by technologies that wouldn't be invented for years. But there was something valuable in his passion for understanding how humans responded to existential threats. War, regardless of its scale or the technologies involved, revealed fundamental truths about human nature. Courage, sacrifice, leadership, and the willingness to stand against impossible odds, these were constants that transcended any particular conflict. As Mr. Patterson discussed the importance of intelligence gathering and strategic thinking, Sarah found herself thinking about her own war, about the decisions she'd made and the prices she'd paid. Intelligence had indeed been crucial, but so had intuition, the ability to make impossible choices with incomplete information while carrying the weight of entire worlds on her shoulders. The class period ended with an assignment to write an essay about leadership during times of crisis. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. She could write a doctoral dissertation on the subject based on personal experience, but she was expected to produce a high school essay based on textbook research. Her final class of the day was chemistry, taught by Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman who approached her subject with the kind of methodical precision that Sarah appreciated. Chemistry had been the foundation for much of the technology she'd used in her previous life. Understanding how matter interacted at the molecular level had been essential for comprehending the more exotic physics she'd eventually encounter. But, sitting in that classroom, working through basic molecular equations, Sarah found herself remembering simpler times when chemistry had been about understanding the world around her rather than surviving in environments that shouldn't have been able to support human life. As the school day ended and students began their exodus toward buses, cars, and whatever after-school activities claimed their attention, Sarah found herself standing alone in the parking lot, waiting for her mother to arrive. Around her, teenagers engaged in the complex social rituals that marked the end of the academic day, making plans, sharing gossip, engaging in the kind of casual interactions that she'd once taken for granted. She was no longer part of their world, if she'd ever truly been part of it. The experiences that had shaped her into humanity's defender had also isolated her from the very people she'd fought to protect. Standing there, watching normal teenagers live normal lives, Sarah felt the weight of her unique situation more keenly than she had all day. She wasn't just a fish out of water, she was a creature from a different ocean entirely, trying to survive in an environment that no longer felt natural to her. The question was whether she could learn to breathe in this new world, or whether she was destined to remain forever caught between who she'd been and who she was supposed to become. Her mother's car pulled up, and Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, grateful for the familiar comfort of family, even if that family existed in a timeline that felt increasingly surreal. "How was your first day?" her mother asked, the question carrying genuine interest and concern. "Interesting," Sarah replied, which was probably the most accurate single-word summary she could provide. "Different from what I expected. New schools always are. Give it time, sweetheart. I'm sure you'll find your place." Find her place. That was exactly what she needed to do, but the challenge was figuring out where that place was supposed to be. She'd once had a clear purpose, a mission that defined every aspect of her existence. Now she had to discover what her purpose was in a world that didn't know it needed saving, among people who had no idea what threats might be waiting in the darkness between stars. As they drove home through streets that looked exactly like her childhood memories, Sarah stared out the window and wondered if she was meant to be a protector in this timeline too, or if she was simply meant to be Sarah Chen, high school student, learning to live a normal life for the first time in decades. Either way, she had a feeling that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and new opportunities to figure out who she was supposed to become in this strange new world that was somehow also her old life made manifest. The day had been a beginning, but of what, she wasn't yet sure. 3 weeks into her new life at Jefferson High, Sarah had established a routine that felt almost normal, if she didn't think too hard about the surreal nature of her situation. She attended classes, took notes on subjects she'd mastered decades ago, completed homework assignments that felt like reviewing ancient textbooks, and gradually began to understand the social ecosystem that governed teenage life. Her friendship with Amanda had developed naturally, built on shared interests in science and a mutual appreciation for intellectual conversations that went beyond the usual high school concerns. Amanda was brilliant in the way that truly gifted people often were, seeing connections and patterns that others missed, asking questions that revealed depths of understanding her teachers couldn't match. It was during their Wednesday afternoon study session in the library that everything changed. "Check this out," Amanda whispered, sliding a book across the table toward Sarah. The cover was worn and the binding loose, clearly an older text that had seen considerable use. "I found it in the back section, filed under theoretical physics. Most of the equations don't make sense, but some of them are incredible." Sarah looked down at the title, Dimensional Mechanics and Temporal Displacement Theory by Dr. Elena Vasquez. The name hit her like a physical blow. Dr. Vasquez had been her mentor during her graduate studies, decades in the future, a brilliant scientist who'd pioneered much of the theoretical framework that had made interstellar travel possible. But, according to the timeline Sarah remembered, Vasquez shouldn't publish her groundbreaking work for another 15 years. "Where did you say you found this?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady while her mind raced through implications. "Back corner, section 530.1. It was misshelved with the regular physics texts, but it's obviously way more advanced than anything else they have." Amanda opened the book to a page covered with equations that Sarah recognized immediately. "Look at this stuff. It's talking about folding spacetime, creating stable wormholes, even theoretical time travel. The math is insane, but it's internally consistent." Sarah stared at the equations, her heart racing. These weren't just theoretical constructs, they were the actual mathematical frameworks that had made her return to this timeline possible. The temporal displacement that had brought her here operated on principles that Dr. Vasquez was apparently already exploring, years ahead of when she should have developed them. "Can I borrow this?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully casual. "Sure, but good luck understanding it. I've been working on the first chapter for a week and I'm barely following the basic concepts." Amanda closed the book and passed it to Sarah. "Maybe we can figure it out together. It's like the author is describing technologies that don't exist yet." That was exactly the problem. The technologies described in the book shouldn't exist yet, but Sarah had lived through their development and implementation. Either the timeline was far more complex than she'd realized, or her presence here had triggered changes that went deeper than she'd imagined. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to focus on her regular homework while her mind churned through possibilities. That evening, alone in her room, she opened the book and began to read with the desperate intensity of someone searching for answers to questions they hadn't known they needed to ask. The text was clearly Dr. Vasquez's work, exhibiting the same brilliant insight and methodical approach that Sarah remembered from her future mentor. But it was also different, more theoretical, less refined than the versions of these concepts that Sarah had studied decades later. It was as if she was reading rough drafts of ideas that would eventually reshape human understanding of the universe. More troubling were the handwritten notes in the margins, clearly added by someone other than the original author. The handwriting was precise and mathematical, filled with corrections and extensions to Vasquez's original formulas. Sarah recognized some of the mathematical frameworks being developed. They were approaches that wouldn't be discovered for another decade in her original timeline. Someone else was working with knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. The next day at school, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to details she'd previously dismissed. Teachers who seemed to know more than they should about advanced concepts. Students who asked questions that revealed unusually sophisticated thinking. Small anomalies that might indicate the presence of other displaced individuals or advanced knowledge that had somehow leaked into this timeline. During physics class, Dr. Webb was discussing basic quantum mechanics when one of the other students, a quiet boy named Marcus who usually sat in the back, raised his hand. Dr. Webb, Marcus said, what if quantum entanglement could be scaled up beyond particle pairs? Could you theoretically create entangled systems large enough to transmit information instantaneously across galactic distances? The question hung in the air like a challenge. It was exactly the kind of advanced thinking that had led to the development of faster-than-light communication systems, concepts that shouldn't be accessible to a high school student in this timeline. Dr. Webb paused, clearly intrigued by the sophistication of the question. That's a fascinating idea, Marcus. The theoretical framework exists, but the practical challenges would be enormous. Are you thinking about applications in space exploration? Something like that, Marcus replied, but his eyes met Sarah's across the classroom, and she saw something there that made her stomach drop. Recognition. He knew who she was. After class, Sarah lingered in the hallway, pretending to organize her books while watching Marcus from the corner of her eye. He moved with a purposefulness that reminded her of military training, scanning his environment with the automatic awareness that came from years of living with potential threats. When he approached her, Sarah was ready. Commander Chen, he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of respect that military personnel used when addressing superior officers. We need to talk. I don't know what you mean, Sarah replied, but her tactical instincts were already engaged, mapping exit routes and potential defensive positions. Marcus Webb, he said, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed casual but allowed him to check for concealed weapons. Lieutenant, Temporal Reconnaissance Division. We've been looking for you. The name clicked into place. Marcus Webb wasn't just a student, he was Dr. Marcus Webb's son, and, in her original timeline, he joined the military during the early stages of the war. But, Temporal Reconnaissance Division was a unit that shouldn't exist yet, part of the advanced military structure that had developed in response to threats that hadn't emerged in this timeline. How many of you are there? Sarah asked, abandoning any pretense of not understanding the situation. 7 that we know of, Marcus replied. All displaced from various points in the original timeline. We've been trying to determine why we're here and whether our presence represents an opportunity or a threat to this timeline's stability. And what conclusions have you reached? That's what we need to discuss. There's a meeting tonight, 7 p.m., at the old warehouse on 5th Street. We need to coordinate our response to what's coming. What's coming? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The same things that destroyed our original timeline. We have evidence that the initial stages are already beginning. The question is whether we can prevent them or if our presence here will only accelerate the process. Marcus melted back into the crowd of students before Sarah could respond, leaving her standing in the hallway with more questions than answers. The revelation that she wasn't alone, that other displaced individuals were operating in this timeline, changed everything. It suggested that her presence here wasn't a random accident but part of some larger pattern or purpose. The rest of the day passed in a blur of normal classes and ordinary conversations that felt increasingly surreal given what she'd learned. Sarah found herself studying her classmates and teachers with new eyes, wondering if any of them were hiding similar secrets, if the mundane facade of high school life was concealing a much more complex reality. That evening, she told her parents she was going to the library to study, a lie that felt heavier than it should have given the magnitude of the deception she was living every day. The warehouse Marcus had mentioned was in an older part of town, the kind of industrial area that had seen better days and was now home to abandoned buildings and forgotten dreams. Sarah approached the location with tactical caution, using skills that felt natural despite her teenage body. She scouted the perimeter, identified potential ambush points, and planned multiple escape routes before she was satisfied that the meeting was legitimate. The warehouse's interior had been converted into a makeshift command center, complete with holographic displays that definitely shouldn't have existed in this timeline and equipment that represented technology decades ahead of what was publicly available. 7 figures stood around a central table, their faces illuminated by the glow of advanced displays. Sarah recognized some of them immediately. Captain Rodriguez from the 3rd Fleet, Sergeant Kim from the Special Operations Division, Dr. Patel from the Theoretical Physics Division. Others were unfamiliar, but all carried themselves with the bearing of people who'd served in humanity's defense during its darkest hours. "Commander Chen," Captain Rodriguez said, stepping forward with a crisp salute.
"Good to see you again, ma'am."
"Captain," Sarah replied, falling naturally into command protocols that felt like putting on a familiar uniform.
"Report."
"We've been monitoring temporal displacement events for the past 6 months," Rodriguez said, activating a holographic display that showed a timeline marked with numerous red indicators. "Individuals from our original timeline have been arriving at various points, always connected to moments of critical importance to their younger selves."
"What's the pattern?"
Sarah asked, studying the data with the analytical mind that had once coordinated fleet movements across multiple star systems. Dr. Patel stepped forward, his voice carrying the same brilliant intensity she remembered. "Each displacement event corresponds to a decision point that would have been crucial to that individual's development in the original timeline. You arrived at the beginning of your senior year, the point when you first met Dr. Webb and began developing your interest in advanced physics."
"And the others?" "Similar patterns."
Marcus arrived at the beginning of his junior year, when he would have first shown interest in military service. "I arrived during my first year of graduate studies, when I began developing the theories that would eventually lead to our understanding of temporal mechanics." Sarah processed this information, fitting the pieces together into a larger picture.
"Someone or something is deliberately repositioning key individuals at critical moments in their development. The question is why?"
"We have a theory about that," Sergeant Kim said, activating another display that showed astronomical data.
"We've detected energy signatures consistent with dimensional incursion events.
The same types of distortions that preceded the Zephyrian invasion in our original timeline."
The room fell silent as the implications sank in.
Sarah stared at the data, recognizing patterns that had haunted her nightmares for decades.
The Zephyrian invasion had begun with subtle reality distortions, dimensional weak points that had allowed hostile forces to enter their universe.
If the same phenomena were occurring in this timeline, it meant that humanity was facing the same existential threat that had nearly destroyed them before.
"Timeline for initial contact?" Sarah asked, slipping into operational mode.
"Based on the progression of disturbances, we estimate 6 months before the first major incursion events," Dr. Patel replied.
"But the pattern is accelerating.
Our presence here seems to be affecting the rate of progression."
"How so?" Captain Rodriguez pulled up another display, this one showing energy readings over time.
"Every time one of us uses knowledge or abilities from our original timeline, it creates ripple effects.
Small changes that compound over time. We're inadvertently accelerating the very events we might want to prevent."
Sarah studied the data, her mind working through the tactical implications. The displacement had given them advanced knowledge of the threats humanity would face, but using that knowledge might ensure that those threats emerged even more quickly than before. It was a classic temporal paradox, the kind of logical trap that had made time travel one of the most dangerous technologies ever developed.
"What about Dr. Vasquez's research?" she asked.
"One of the students at school found a book containing theories that shouldn't exist yet."
The group exchanged glances that suggested they'd been discussing this exact issue.
"Dr. Vasquez disappeared 3 months ago," Dr. Patel said quietly.
"Her laboratory was found empty, all her research missing.
We believe she may have been contacted by the same forces responsible for our displacement. Or," Marcus added, "she may have been displaced herself and is working from a different position in this timeline." The complexity of the situation was becoming overwhelming. Multiple displaced individuals, accelerating timeline changes, missing scientists, and the approaching threat of an invasion that had nearly destroyed humanity once before. Sarah felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders again, the familiar burden of being responsible for decisions that would affect the fate of entire civilizations. "What's our operational status?" she asked.
"Limited," Captain Rodriguez admitted.
"We have some advanced technology, but nothing approaching the resources we'd need to mount a defense against a full-scale invasion.
Most of our equipment is jury-rigged from components that technically shouldn't exist yet." Personnel? The 7 of us, plus whatever allies we can recruit from the existing population.
But, we're constrained by the need to maintain operational security. Too much revealed too quickly could cause panic or, worse, interference from government agencies that aren't prepared to handle the reality of what we're facing. Sarah nodded, understanding the delicate balance they had to maintain. Too little action, and humanity would be caught unprepared when the invasion began. Too much, and they risked destabilizing the timeline in ways that could make the situation worse. I need detailed briefings on everyone's capabilities and current operational status, she said. We need to develop a comprehensive strategy that accounts for the temporal displacement effects while preparing for the threats we know are coming. Yes, ma'am, the group replied in unison, the automatic response of people who'd served together under impossible circumstances. As the briefings began, Sarah found herself slipping back into the role that had defined her existence for so long. The teenage life she'd been trying to construct felt like a thin disguise over the reality of who she truly was. She was a military commander, a protector of humanity, someone who dedicated her existence to standing against forces that threatened everything she'd ever cared about. But, this time, she wasn't alone. This time, she had allies who understood the magnitude of what they faced and the resources to potentially change the outcome. The question was whether they could work within the constraints of their situation to prevent the catastrophe they'd already lived through once. The meeting continued deep into the night, covering everything from resource allocation to recruitment strategies to the complex temporal mechanics that governed their situation. By the time Sarah made her way home, she had a comprehensive understanding of their operational capabilities and the challenges they faced. She also had a new sense of purpose that felt both familiar and terrifying. The normal life she'd been trying to build was officially over. The universe had given her a second chance not to live peacefully, but to fight more effectively for humanity's survival. The next morning, she returned to Jefferson High School with new eyes. The building wasn't just an educational institution, it was a potential command center, a recruitment facility, and a cover for operations that would determine the fate of human civilization. Her classmates weren't just teenagers struggling with adolescent concerns, they were potential allies, resources, and responsibilities that she might need to protect when the real war began. During physics class, she caught Marcus's eye and nodded slightly, a signal that she'd accepted the reality of their situation and was ready to begin the work of preparing for what was coming. Dr. Webb continued his lesson on basic electromagnetic theory, unaware that several of his students were planning to save the world using principles he wouldn't officially discover for another decade. At lunch, Amanda joined her with her usual enthusiasm for intellectual discussion, and Sarah found herself looking at her friend with new understanding. Amanda was brilliant, possibly brilliant enough to contribute to their preparations if she could be trusted with the truth. But revealing that truth would fundamentally change Amanda's life, potentially destroying the normal existence that Sarah had been briefly envious of. You seem different today, Amanda observed, studying Sarah's face with the perceptiveness that made her such a good friend and such a potential asset. Just thinking about some things Dr. Webb discussed, Sarah replied, which was technically true even if it vastly understated the complexity of what she was actually contemplating. Want to work on that Vasquez book tonight? I think I'm starting to understand some of the mathematical frameworks, but I could use a second perspective. Actually, Sarah said, making a decision that felt both necessary and dangerous, there's something I need to tell you about that book. And about some other things that have been happening lately. Amanda's expression shifted from casual interest to focused attention. That sounds ominous. It's complicated, Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. But I think you might be exactly the kind of person who'd understand complicated. That afternoon, after school had ended and the hallways had emptied of their normal chaos, Sarah and Amanda found themselves alone in the physics classroom where Dr. Webb was grading papers at his desk. It was time to begin the process of bringing new people into their circle, starting with the 2 individuals who might be most capable of understanding what they were truly dealing with. Dr. Webb, Sarah said, approaching his desk with Amanda beside her, we need to discuss some advanced concepts that go beyond the normal curriculum. Things related to temporal mechanics and dimensional theory. Dr. Webb looked up from his papers, his expression shifting from casual interest to sharp attention as he recognized something in Sarah's tone that suggested this wasn't a normal academic discussion. That's a very specific area of study, he said carefully.
What's prompted this interest? Sarah exchanged a look with Amanda, then made the decision that would change everything for all of them. Because, she said, we have reason to believe that some of the theories in Dr. Vasquez's research are more than just theoretical. And, because we need your help to prevent something terrible from happening to everyone we care about. The conversation that followed would mark the real beginning of their preparations, the moment when a small group of displaced soldiers and brilliant civilians began the work of saving a world that didn't yet know it needed saving. Outside the classroom windows, the ordinary life of Jefferson High continued, unaware that the fate of human civilization was being discussed in their physics classroom by people who'd already lived through humanity's darkest hours and were determined not to let them happen again. The conversation in Dr. Webb's classroom stretched into the evening hours, transforming from a cautious revelation into an intensive briefing session that would have been familiar to anyone who'd served in military intelligence. Dr. Webb and Amanda had initially responded with the skepticism that any rational person would display when confronted with claims about time travel and interdimensional threats. But the evidence Sarah and Marcus presented was overwhelming. The mathematical frameworks in Dr. Vasquez's book weren't just theoretical constructs, they were practical blueprints for technologies that Sarah could describe in detail because she'd used them. Marcus's knowledge of military protocols that wouldn't be developed for years provided corroboration that went beyond what any teenager should possess. Most convincing of all was the demonstration Marcus gave using a small device that projected holographic displays with clarity and complexity that exceeded anything available in current technology. So you're telling me, Dr. Webb said, staring at the holographic representation of a dimensional incursion event, that in your original timeline, Earth was invaded by beings from another dimension, humanity barely survived a war that lasted decades, and now you've somehow been sent back to prevent it from happening again? That's a simplified version, Sarah replied, but essentially accurate. The temporal displacement appears to have been deliberately engineered to position key individuals at critical moments when they could potentially influence the outcome. Amanda had remained silent during most of the explanation, but her mind was clearly working through the implications at a furious pace. The energy requirements for that kind of temporal manipulation would be enormous, she said finally. What force could engineer something on that scale? We don't know, Marcus admitted. Our best theory is that it's connected to the same entities that caused the original invasion. Perhaps they're attempting to create a more favorable outcome for themselves, or maybe they're trying to prevent something even worse from happening. Dr. Webb stood up and began pacing, a habit Sarah remembered from her original timeline when he was working through complex theoretical problems. If this is true, and I'm finding it increasingly difficult to believe it isn't, then we're talking about a conspiracy that operates across time and space. The implications are staggering. The implications are irrelevant if we don't survive the immediate threat, Sarah said, her command training asserting itself. We have approximately 6 months before the first major incursion events begin. We need to use that time to prepare humanity's defenses and identify potential allies who can help us. What kind of defenses? Amanda asked. If these beings can manipulate reality at a dimensional level, what could we possibly do to stop them? Sarah activated her own holographic display, one that showed technical specifications for weapons and defense systems that represented decades of technological advancement beyond current human capabilities. In our original timeline, we eventually developed countermeasures. Energy weapons that could disrupt their dimensional matrices, shielding technology that could protect against reality distortion effects, and detection systems that could give us advance warning of incursion events. But that technology took years to develop, Marcus added. We're trying to compress decades of research and development into months. It's theoretically possible, especially since we have the advantage of knowing what works, but it will require resources and expertise that we currently lack. Dr. Webb studied the technical specifications with the intensity of someone trying to understand concepts that challenged his fundamental assumptions about physics. Some of these principles are extrapolations of current theoretical work, but others seem to require completely new approaches to understanding matter and energy. You're talking about rewriting the foundations of modern physics. Not rewriting, Sarah corrected. Accelerating. All of these discoveries were made by human scientists in our timeline. We're just trying to help them make the same discoveries faster. Amanda leaned forward, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement that came from encountering problems that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. What would you need to develop these technologies, I mean? What resources and capabilities would be required?
Funding, personnel, facilities, and time, Marcus replied. We need to establish a research and development operation that can work in parallel with existing scientific institutions without attracting unwanted attention from government agencies or other groups that might interfere with our mission.
And we need to recruit people who can contribute to the effort, Sarah added.
Scientists, engineers, military personnel, and support staff who can understand the magnitude of what we're facing and commit to doing whatever is necessary to prevent it. Dr. Webb stopped pacing and turned to face them directly. You're talking about creating a shadow organization dedicated to fighting a war that hasn't started yet against an enemy that most people would consider science fiction.
How do you propose to accomplish that without being dismissed as delusional or dangerous?
Carefully, Sarah said. We start with people who are already working on related research, people who are open to advanced concepts and capable of understanding the evidence we can provide.
We build credibility through demonstration and results, not just theoretical arguments.
And we leverage the resources that are already available, Marcus added. There are military research projects, university laboratories, and private companies that are working on technologies that could be adapted for our purposes. We don't need to start from nothing. We need to guide existing efforts in directions that will be useful when the time comes. Amanda was studying the holographic displays with the focused intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle.
The quantum entanglement communication systems you described, she said, they're based on principles that Professor Martinez at the State University has been exploring.
And the energy shielding technology looks like an extension of the electromagnetic field research that Techdyne Corporation has been conducting.
You're familiar with their work? Dr.
Webb asked, surprised by Amanda's knowledge of advanced research projects. I do a lot of reading, Amanda replied with a slight smile.
And I've been corresponding with researchers who are working on theoretical problems that interest me.
Most of them don't mind discussing their work with a curious high school student, especially one who can ask intelligent questions. Sarah felt a moment of recognition, remembering her own teenage hunger for knowledge that went beyond what was available in standard curricula.
Amanda's intellectual curiosity and networking capabilities could be invaluable assets if she was willing to commit to their mission.
There's something else we need to consider, Dr. Webb said, his expression growing more serious. If you're right about the timeline and the scope of the threat, then we're not just talking about preventing an invasion.
We're talking about fundamentally altering the course of human development.
The technologies you're describing, the knowledge you possess, they represent advances that could change everything about how our civilization develops.
That's the point, Marcus said.
In our original timeline, humanity survived, but barely. Billions died, entire planets were rendered uninhabitable, and our species came within days of extinction. If we can prevent that from happening, if we can give humanity the tools it needs to defend itself more effectively, then the cost is worth paying.
But what about the consequences? Amanda asked. If you change the timeline, what happens to the people who existed in your original version? Do they cease to exist? Are you essentially committing genocide on a cosmic scale?
The question hung in the air like a physical presence, highlighting the moral complexity of their situation. Sarah had wrestled with these same ethical concerns since arriving in this timeline, and she still didn't have answers that satisfied her completely.
We don't know, she admitted.
The mathematics of temporal displacement suggest that we're creating a parallel timeline rather than overwriting the original, but the evidence is inconclusive. What we do know is that in our original timeline, humanity suffered losses that were almost beyond comprehension.
If there's a chance to prevent that suffering, we have to try.
Dr. Webb nodded slowly, understanding the impossible choice they were facing. So we're gambling the certainty of billions of lives that have already been lost against the possibility of preventing those losses in a different timeline. It's the kind of decision that would drive anyone insane if they thought about it too much.
Which is why we focus on the practical aspects, Sarah said.
We have 6 months to prepare for threats that we know are coming. We can spend that time debating the philosophical implications of our actions, or we can spend it building the tools and alliances that might save lives.
I know which option I prefer.
Amanda stood up suddenly, moving to the whiteboard at the front of the classroom and beginning to write equations that Sarah recognized as early versions of dimensional matrix calculations. "If we're going to do this," she said, "we need to be smart about it. We need a comprehensive plan that accounts for resource acquisition, personnel recruitment, technology development, and operational security." "Agreed," Marcus said, activating another holographic display that showed an organizational chart with various operational divisions. "We've been working on preliminary planning, but we need more detailed strategies for each aspect of the mission." Over the next several hours, the four of them worked together to develop what amounted to a business plan for preventing the end of the world. They identified key research projects that could be guided or accelerated, scientists and engineers who might be recruited to their cause, and military personnel who could be trusted with information about the coming threat. Dr. Webb contributed his knowledge of the academic community and his connections within various research institutions. Amanda provided insights into current theoretical work being conducted by universities and private companies, along with detailed analysis of how various technologies could be adapted for their purposes. Marcus supplied military expertise and understanding of how to build and maintain operational security for a clandestine organization. Sarah found herself naturally taking on the role of overall coordinator, using her command experience to integrate the various aspects of their planning into a coherent strategy. It felt familiar and comfortable, like putting on clothes that fit perfectly after wearing an uncomfortable costume for weeks. "We'll need funding," Dr. Webb pointed out as they discussed the resources required for their research and development efforts. "The kind of money we're talking about isn't available through normal academic or military channels." "Actually," Amanda said with a mysterious smile, "that might not be as much of a problem as you think. There are private investors who are very interested in advanced technology development, especially if it can be presented in terms of commercial applications rather than military ones." "You know investors?" Marcus asked, surprised. "I know people who know investors," Amanda replied. "And some of the technologies you're describing would have enormous commercial value even if they weren't being developed for defense purposes. Quantum communication systems, advanced materials science, energy manipulation technologies, these are concepts that could revolutionize multiple industries." Sarah recognized the strategic thinking behind Amanda's suggestion. By positioning their research as commercial development rather than military preparation, they could attract funding and resources while maintaining the operational security that would be essential to their success. "We'll need to be careful about how we present the information," Dr. Webb warned. "Too much revelation too quickly could cause problems with government agencies or competing research groups." "Agreed," Sarah said. "We control the flow of information, providing just enough to generate interest and support without revealing the full scope of what we're trying to accomplish." As the evening progressed, their planning session evolved into something that resembled the strategic briefing Sarah remembered from her military service. They developed timelines, assigned responsibilities, and established protocols for communication and coordination. By the time they were ready to conclude, they had the framework for an organization that could potentially accomplish what seemed impossible, preparing humanity for a war that hadn't started yet against an enemy that most people couldn't imagine. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Sarah said as they began to pack up their materials. "The other displaced individuals. We need to integrate them into our planning and make sure we're all working toward the same objectives. Some of them have been working independently," Marcus explained. "Captain Rodriguez has been focusing on military preparation, while Dr. Patel has been trying to establish connections with the theoretical physics community. We'll need to coordinate our efforts to avoid duplication and ensure maximum effectiveness. And we need to consider the possibility that there may be other displaced individuals we haven't identified yet," Amanda added. "If the pattern continues, we could have additional resources and expertise becoming available over the next few months." Dr. Webb gathered his papers and looked around the classroom that had just become the headquarters for a conspiracy to save the world. "This is either the most important thing I'll ever be involved in, or the most elaborate delusion in human history. Either way, I'm committed to seeing where it leads." "It's real," Sarah assured him. "And it's necessary. Thank you for trusting us enough to listen." "Thank you for trusting me enough to share it," he replied. "I'll start reaching out to my contacts in the research community tomorrow." carefully, but with enough urgency to begin building the network we'll need.
As they prepared to leave, Amanda turned to Sarah with an expression that combined excitement with apprehension. "You know this changes everything, right? My life, your life, all of our lives.
Once we start down this path, there's no going back to normal teenage existence."
"There was never any going back," Sarah replied. "The question is whether we spend the time we have pretending to be normal or using it to build something that might actually make a difference." Amanda nodded, understanding the weight of the commitment she was making.
"Then, let's build something that makes a difference." They left the school building together, walking through hallways that looked the same as they had that morning but felt fundamentally different.
Jefferson High School was no longer just an educational institution, it was the birthplace of humanity's defense against annihilation.
Over the next few days, the carefully orchestrated expansion of their conspiracy began. Dr. Webb made contact with selected colleagues, presenting theoretical problems that would naturally lead them toward research areas that would be useful for their purposes. Amanda began reaching out to her network of researchers and investors, planting seeds of interest in advanced technology development projects. Marcus coordinated with the other displaced individuals, ensuring that their various efforts were aligned and mutually supporting. Sarah found herself dividing her time between maintaining her cover as a normal student and working on strategic planning that would determine the fate of human civilization. The transformation was remarkably smooth, aided by the fact that none of them was working completely alone. Each new recruit brought additional capabilities and connections, expanding their network in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. Within a week, they had established contact with 12 research institutions, 6 private companies, and 3 military research projects that could contribute to their mission. The key was framing their requests in terms that made sense within the context of normal scientific and commercial development. They weren't asking people to believe in time travel and interdimensional invasion, they were asking them to explore theoretical possibilities that might lead to breakthrough technologies with significant practical applications. But, beneath the surface of legitimate academic and commercial activity, a shadow organization was taking shape, one dedicated to preparing for a war that would determine whether humanity survived to see the next century. Sarah felt the familiar weight of command settling on her shoulders, but this time she wasn't carrying the burden alone. For the first time since her displacement, she began to feel hope that they might actually succeed in changing the outcome of events that had once seemed inevitable. The alliance they were building was stronger and more comprehensive than anything that had existed in her original timeline, brought together by shared knowledge and unified purpose rather than formed in desperate response to immediate crisis. They had 6 months to save the world, and, for the first time, Sarah thought they might actually be able to do it. 2 months into their operation, Sarah barely recognized the life she'd been living. Jefferson High School remained her official identity, but her real existence had become a carefully orchestrated dance between maintaining teenage normalcy and coordinating humanity's secret preparation for interdimensional warfare. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. What had started as a small group of displaced individuals had evolved into a network spanning 3 continents, involving over 40 research facilities and employing more than 200 scientists, engineers, and support personnel. All of them thought they were working on cutting-edge commercial and military research projects. None of them realized they were part of humanity's last line of defense against annihilation. Sarah stood in what had once been an abandoned warehouse but was now a state-of-the-art command center, watching Dr. Patel conduct a briefing for the latest group of recruited researchers. Holographic displays showed the progress of various development projects, each one representing a critical component of their defensive preparations. "The quantum entanglement communication array is operational," Dr. Patel reported, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd spent weeks solving theoretical problems that had stumped entire university departments. "We can now maintain instantaneous communication across continental distances, which will be essential for coordinating our response when the incursion events begin." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward to provide the military update. "Defensive positions are being established at 17 strategic locations. We're using the cover of joint military exercises and emergency preparedness training to position personnel and equipment without attracting attention from government oversight agencies." "What about the detection grid?" Sarah asked, studying a map that showed sensor arrays positioned across the globe. 73% operational, Marcus replied. We're detecting low-level dimensional disturbances at an increasing rate, which confirms our timeline projections. The energy signatures are becoming more pronounced, suggesting that the incursion events are approaching faster than we originally calculated. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced in her original timeline when intelligence reports indicated that the enemy was adapting faster than expected.
How much faster? We're now projecting initial contact in 3 months rather than 4, Dr. Patel said, his expression grim. And, the scale appears to be larger than what we experienced previously. Whatever changes our presence has made to this timeline, they've accelerated the enemy's timetable. Amanda, who had been working on a portable tablet while listening to the briefings, looked up with an expression that mixed excitement with concern. I think I know why. The research we've been guiding, the technologies we've been developing, they're creating energy signatures that may be attracting attention from the other side of the dimensional barriers. She activated a holographic display that showed energy patterns recorded by their detection grid over the past 2 months. Look at this progression.
Every time we activate a new quantum communication array or test an energy shielding system, we see corresponding spikes in dimensional disturbance activity. We're not just preparing to defend against the invasion, we're inadvertently accelerating its arrival.
The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications.
They were caught in a temporal paradox that was becoming increasingly complex. The more prepared they became, the sooner they would need to use their preparations.
Options?
Sarah asked, slipping into the command mode that had become second nature during crisis situations. We could reduce our development activities, Captain Rodriguez suggested. Scale back the research to minimize our energy signature.
That would leave us unprepared when the invasion begins, Dr. Patel pointed out.
We need every technological advantage we can develop if we're going to have any chance of success. Or, Amanda said thoughtfully, we could complete our preparations as quickly as possible and, then, prepare for an earlier confrontation. If we're going to attract their attention anyway, maybe we should be ready to fight when they arrive. Sarah studied the data displays, calculating odds and possibilities with the analytical mindset that had once guided fleet movements across multiple star systems. The situation was complex, but not unprecedented. They were racing against a deadline that kept moving closer, which meant they needed to optimize their resource allocation and prioritize their most critical developments.
We accelerate everything, she decided. All research projects move to priority status.
We complete our defensive preparations in 8 weeks instead of 12, and we prepare for initial contact in 10 weeks.
It's aggressive, but it's better than being caught unprepared.
That's going to require additional resources, Marcus pointed out.
More personnel, more funding, more equipment. And it's going to increase our exposure risk. Then, we manage the risks, Sarah replied. Dr. Webb, what's our status with the academic recruitment network?
Dr. Webb, who had been coordinating research efforts from his position at Jefferson High, activated another display showing their recruitment statistics. We have access to 37 university research teams and 14 private laboratories. Most of them don't realize they're working on related projects, but we can coordinate their efforts to accelerate development timelines.
Do it, Sarah said. Amanda, what's our financial situation?
Better than expected, Amanda replied with a slight smile. Turns out that when you can provide investors with working prototypes of technologies that shouldn't exist yet, they're very willing to provide funding for further development. We're currently operating with a budget that exceeds the GDP of most small countries.
Sarah felt a moment of appreciation for Amanda's business acumen.
Her friend had proven to be remarkably gifted at translating advanced scientific concepts into commercial opportunities, creating funding streams that allowed their operation to expand without depending on government resources or oversight.
Security status?
Sarah asked, turning to Sergeant Kim, who had been responsible for maintaining operational security.
No significant breaches, Kim reported.
We've had some inquiries from government agencies, but we've been able to redirect their attention toward the commercial aspects of our research. As far as anyone knows, we're just a well-funded technology development consortium.
Keep monitoring, Sarah said.
If any government agencies get too interested in our activities, we need to know immediately.
The last thing we can afford is official interference when we're this close to operational readiness.
As the briefing continued, Sarah found herself thinking about the teenagers she sat next to in classes every day, the friends she'd made who had no idea that their world was about to be threatened by forces beyond their imagination. The weight of protecting them, of protecting everyone, felt heavier than it had in her original timeline because now she knew what the cost of failure would be. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Amanda, who was sitting across the room but couldn't speak freely in front of the larger group.
Need to talk privately. Important.
Sarah nodded slightly and continued listening to the operational updates while wondering what new complications Amanda had discovered. Their operation was becoming increasingly complex, with dozens of moving parts that required constant coordination and adjustment. Every success created new challenges, and every solution revealed new problems that needed to be addressed. The briefing concluded with assignments for the accelerated development timeline. Research teams would be working around the clock, defensive positions would be expedited, and recruitment efforts would be expanded to include specialists they'd originally planned to approach later in their timeline. As the group dispersed to their various assignments, Amanda approached Sarah with the kind of expression that indicated she discovered something significant and potentially problematic.
What is it?
Sarah asked, leading Amanda to a secure conference room where they could speak privately.
I've been analyzing the communication patterns between our research facilities, Amanda said, activating a portable display that showed network traffic data. We're not the only ones who are interested in the work we're doing.
The display showed communication intercepts that revealed monitoring activities by several government agencies and at least 2 private intelligence organizations.
Sarah studied the patterns, recognizing the signatures of surveillance operations that were becoming increasingly sophisticated. How much do they know? Sarah asked.
Hard to say, Amanda replied.
But they're definitely aware that something unusual is happening.
The level of technological advancement we're demonstrating is attracting attention from people who make it their business to know about advanced research projects. Sarah felt the familiar tension that came with knowing that their operational security was being compromised. In her original timeline, she'd dealt with similar challenges, but the stakes had been different.
Then, they'd been trying to protect military secrets during wartime.
Now, they were trying to protect humanity's survival while pretending that the threat didn't exist yet.
Recommendations? Sarah asked. We need to implement additional security measures, Amanda said.
Compartmentalization, disinformation campaigns, and possibly some strategic misdirection to keep the intelligence agencies focused on the wrong aspects of our operation.
Can you handle that?
Amanda's expression shifted to something that reminded Sarah of her own command persona.
I've been learning from some very good teachers. I think I can manage it.
Over the next few weeks, Sarah watched Amanda coordinate a counterintelligence operation that would have impressed the professionals she'd worked with during her military service. False research projects were established to provide plausible explanations for their activities, legitimate commercial developments were emphasized to overshadow the more sensitive aspects of their work, and carefully managed leaks provided intelligence agencies with information that was accurate but incomplete. Meanwhile, the accelerated development timeline was producing results that exceeded their most optimistic projections. The quantum communication systems were operating at full efficiency, providing instantaneous coordination capabilities across their global network. Energy shielding technologies had been successfully tested against simulated dimensional distortions, proving that they could provide effective protection against reality warping attacks. Most importantly, their detection grid was providing increasingly detailed information about the approaching threat. The dimensional disturbances were becoming more frequent and more powerful, creating a clear pattern that allowed them to predict where and when the first incursion events would occur. Northern California, Central Montana, and Eastern Virginia, Dr. Patel announced during their weekly strategic briefing.
Those are the locations where dimensional barriers are weakest.
Based on the progression of disturbances, we're looking at simultaneous incursion events in approximately 6 weeks. Sarah studied the projected timeline, noting how much their accelerated preparations had compressed what should have been months of development into weeks of intensive activity.
Are we ready?
As ready as we can be with the resources and time we have, Captain Rodriguez replied.
Defensive positions are established, personnel are trained, and equipment is deployed.
We won't have the overwhelming technological advantages that would make victory certain, but we have capabilities that didn't exist in our original timeline.
What about civilian evacuation procedures?
That's where things get complicated, Marcus said, activating a display that showed population densities around the projected incursion sites. We can't evacuate entire regions without revealing what we know and causing panic that would interfere with our operations.
But we also can't allow civilians to be caught in the initial attacks.
Sarah recognized the impossible balance they had to maintain. Too much warning would create chaos and potentially interfere with government response systems.
Too little warning would result in casualties they might have prevented.
We create cover stories, she decided. Natural disaster warnings, military training exercises, infrastructure maintenance. Anything that gives people a reason to leave the immediate areas without revealing the real nature of the threat.
And if government agencies start asking questions about our disaster predictions? Amanda asked. We deal with that when it happens, Sarah replied. Our first priority is civilian safety. Everything else is secondary.
As their final weeks of preparation intensified, Sarah found herself spending less time at Jefferson High and more time at their command center. Maintaining her cover as a normal teenager was becoming increasingly difficult when she was coordinating a global defense operation that required constant attention and decision-making. Her grades remained excellent, partly because her accelerated understanding of advanced concepts made high school coursework trivial, but her social relationships were suffering from the demands of her real responsibilities. She rarely had time for normal teenage activities, and, when she did participate, her mind was usually focused on tactical planning and resource allocation rather than the concerns that occupied her classmates.
The irony wasn't lost on her.
She'd been given a chance to experience normal teenage life, but the same circumstances that had made that possible also made it impossible to actually enjoy the experience. You're disappearing, Amanda observed one afternoon as they walked between classes. I know you have important things to do, but you're losing touch with this part of your life. This part of my life isn't real, Sarah replied, then immediately regretted the harsh honesty.
I'm sorry. That wasn't fair to you. Actually, it was completely fair, Amanda said with understanding that surprised Sarah.
This is real for me, but it's not real for you. You're living in a different world, dealing with different problems.
I get that.
I just don't want you to forget that some parts of this life are worth preserving, even if they're not your primary focus. Sarah stopped walking and looked at her friend, seeing the person who had become one of her closest allies and most trusted advisors. Amanda had given up her own normal teenage existence to help.